in the quiet hush before dawn, on the golden banks of the ancient Nile. A woman reaches for her lover not in secrecy, not in shame, but with the same certainty she draws her morning breath. There's no hiding, no guilt, no flinching from the eyes of gods or neighbors. In that world, so far from ours, sex wasn't whispered about in the dark. It was worshipped in sunlight, and here's the twist that might shock you. In ancient Egypt, thousands of years ago, sex was more liberated, more honored, and far healthier than in many parts of our modern world today. This is not your typical history lesson. Tonight, you won't hear about dusty pharaohs and old scrolls. You'll step into a civilization that didn't see sex as sin, but as sacred. A place where love was painted on tomb walls, where desire was a prayer, and intimacy was a way to keep the universe in balance. Imagine a society where physical affection wasn't censored, regulated, or pushed behind closed doors. Instead, it was stitched into the fabric of daily life, like the fine linen robes woven by the Nile's edge, where lovers didn't feel the need to hide their touches, and a soft caress between a married couple wasn't scandalous, it was cosmic. Alignment. In Egypt, sex was not taboo, it was law of nature. The same way the sun rose and the river flooded, people made love not just for survival, but for joy, for health, for harmony. Take the story of Karaf and Lamea, a couple who lived in the sun-drenched heart of ancient Luxor. He was a linen dyer, she, a weaver. Their hands were rough from work, their days filled with toil, but each night, their fingers found their way back to each other like water finds the sea. Not because they were commanded to, not because they had to prove anything, but because they understood that affection was survival, not just of the body, but of the soul. They lived in a modest home, shaded by reeds, with walls thin enough to hear the neighbors' chickens argue. And yet, within that fragile space, they created a sanctuary. Their bed wasn't gilded in gold, but it was sacred. Their connection wasn't measured in candlelit dinners or anniversary cards, it was felt in the shared silence after a long day. In the moment he brought her water before sleep, in the way she smoothed his shoulders with oil, not as duty, but as devotion. In the West, we've spent centuries trying to unlearn the fear we stitched into our skin. We speak of sex in hushed tones, wrapped in euphemisms and performance. We debate it, legislate it, moralize it. But the ancient Egyptians, they just lived it. They believed every act of physical intimacy was tied to math, a universal principle of harmony. If a household was loving, the gods were pleased. If a couple laughed together, held each other, made love with joy, it wasn't just private pleasure, it was cosmic alignment. It meant the crops might grow, the Nile might flood, just right. The balance of life, literally, might hold. Their gods modeled this truth. None of them were ashamed of desire. They flirted, embraced, birthed the universe through acts of pleasure. In Egypt, to touch someone with love wasn't earthly, it was divine. And this, perhaps, is what our world has forgotten. We've traded sacred softness for screens, tender rituals for algorithms. The physical language of love has been buried under dating advice and clinical charts. But maybe, just maybe, if we listen closely to the ancient winds drifting off the Nile, we'll hear something we've long forgotten. That our bodies are not battlegrounds, they are bridges. That desire is not disgrace, it is design. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let this story unfold, allow yourself to wonder, what if we've been taught everything backwards? What if we are the prudish ones, the ones burdened by guilt, while a civilization 3,000 years ago already figured out the truth that love, in all its forms, is sacred? And if that thought stirred something in you, something curious or warm or wild, then maybe it's time we remember not just how the Egyptians lived, but how they loved. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, stories that awaken, surprise, and soften, you don't forget to support the channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It gives me the inspiration to keep uncovering the most beautiful, surprising corners of human history and sharing them with you, night after night. Now, before we move into the next chapter of this story, I've got a little question for you. It's something light, something fun, and something I want you to answer in the comments below. Ready? What was a common symbol of male potency and fertility in ancient Egypt? A. The papyrus flower. B. Romaine. Let us comment your answer below, A or B, and let's see how many of you were paying attention. I'll reveal the answer in the next episode. Until then, rest easy, and remember, history isn't just about what happened, it's about how it felt. Long before digital hearts blinked on screens or whispered notifications stirred midnight cravings for attention, the people of ancient Egypt had a different kind of message. One made not of pixels, but of clay. And what they etched into those sun-baked shards, simple, raw, and wildly human, may be more honest than anything we send today. They were called astraca, broken pieces of pottery or limestone, often discarded from daily life. But to the Egyptians, they became canvases of connection. Among tax records, grocery tallies, and lesson notes lay confessions of longing, of flirtation, of love. And in the city of Thebes, a young spice seller named Bennu used them the way we use texts now to reach out to someone who made his chest flutter. He first saw her by the pomegranate stall. She was laughing, arguing about prices with the vendor, and tucking her braid beneath a scarf that kept slipping off her shoulder. Bennu didn't know her name, but he knew her laugh, and he knew the strange trembling that entered his fingers whenever she passed. So he did what young lovers do when words won't stay in their mouths. He wrote, "I saw you again." He carved carefully into a broken bowl. "You dropped a fig," and smiled as if it meant the sun would rise. "I haven't slept well since." He didn't sign it. He didn't dare hand it to her. Instead, he placed it beneath the base of the fig basket he delivered to her stall each morning. She never spoke of it. But the next week, another piece of pottery appeared near his own stand. "The sun rises, whether I drop figs or not," it read. "But thank you. Your scent is cinnamon. Are you always this bold?" And so it began, a secret courtship through broken shards, two people leaving pieces of themselves hidden in plain sight. Theirs was not a love of declarations, but of slow reveals. It lived not in grand gestures, but in fragments of fired clay passed, like sacred relics between strangers, becoming something more. This wasn't rare. All across Egypt, love messages were hidden in plain sight. In temples, along garden walls, even in the folds of papyrus scrolls. Lovers wrote with reed pens dipped in ink made of soot and wine. Their messages were playful, sharp, or aching, but always personal. And above all, brave, because there's a peculiar kind of courage in writing your desire without certainty. It will be received, or welcomed, or even seen, but they wrote anyway. One note found near a worker's village reads, "You are the reason my mother scolds me. I burn bread and smile while it blackens. My thoughts are not where they should be." Another found, decades later, buried beneath temple steps, simply says, "Did you notice I wore your favorite color today?" This was their version of thinking of you, unlike modern texts, which can be deleted, rephrased, or ghosted away. These notes were carved, permanent. They didn't try to be perfect. They didn't perform. They confessed, and in their imperfection, they became something more than messages. They became memory. Love in ancient Egypt was not only public in its celebration, it was also deeply private in its expression. These whispered exchanges on pottery captured the messines of real affection, the awkwardness of first attraction, the nervous rereads of a message before hiding it under a date basket. Even the gods were not immune to such longing. Temple art shows deities writing to one another, sending tokens through priests and messengers, exchanging poems and festivals. If the divine could crave connection, why shouldn't humans? And what makes these notes so moving today, thousands of years later, is that they remind us how little the human heart has changed. We still stumble over feelings. We still look for signs. We still write words we hope someone will treasure. But there's something ancient Egypt offers that we've nearly lost. The ritual of writing with our hands, with our full presence. There was no autocorrect, no emoji to soften intent. Every letter, every curve of the ink was chosen. And in that act of physical inscription, a piece of the writer was left behind. Perhaps this is why so many of these notes feel like artifacts of the soul. They weren't designed to go viral. They were crafted to touch, to linger, to live inside someone's pocket or memory. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine it cleaner or kinder than it was. But this much is true. The people of Egypt knew how to hold love gently, how to let it unfold slowly, and how to speak it even when their voices shook. Bennu and his mysterious fig girl. Their story may have faded, their names lost, but their notes remain. Quiet testaments to the timeless ache of wanting someone to know, I see you, I think of you. I am brave enough to say it, and maybe that's what we need to remember. Not just how to love, but how to speak love. Not with speed, or flair, or filters, but with care, with risk, with clay beneath our fingernails, and hearts wide open. Long before digital hearts blinked on screens, or whispered notifications stirred midnight cravings for attention, the people of ancient Egypt had a different kind of message. One made not of pixels, but of clay, and what they etched into those sun-baked shards, simple, raw, and wildly human, may be more honest than anything we send today. They were called astraka, broken pieces of pottery or limestone, often discarded from daily life. But to the Egyptians, they became canvases of connection. Among tax records, grocery tallies, and lesson notes lay confessions of longing, of flirtation, of love. And in the city of Thebes, a young spice seller named Bennu used them the way we use texts now to reach out to someone who made his chest flutter. He first saw her by the pomegranate stall. She was laughing, arguing about prices with the vendor, and tucking her braid beneath a scarf that kept slipping off her shoulder. Bennu didn't know her name, but he knew her laugh, and he knew the strange trembling that entered his fingers whenever she passed. So he did what young lovers do when words won't stay in their mouths. He wrote, "I saw you again." He carved carefully into a broken bowl. "You dropped a fig," and smiled as if it meant the sun would rise. "I haven't slept well since." He didn't sign it. He didn't dare hand it to her. Instead, he placed it beneath the base of the fig basket he'd delivered to her stall each morning. She never spoke of it. But the next week, another piece of pottery appeared near his own stand. "The sun rises, whether I drop figs or not," it read. "But thank you. Your scent is cinnamon. Are you always this bold?" And so it began, a secret courtship through broken shards to people, leaving pieces of themselves hidden in plain sight. Theirs was not a love of declarations, but of slow reveals. It lived not in grand gestures, but in fragments of fired clay passed, like sacred relics between strangers, becoming something more. This wasn't rare. All across Egypt, love messages were hidden in plain sight, in temples, along garden walls, even in the folds of papyrus scrolls. Lovers wrote with red pens dipped in ink made of soot and wine. Their messages were playful, sharp, or aching, but always personal, and above all brave, because there's a peculiar kind of courage in writing your desire without certainty it will be received, or welcomed, or even seen. But they wrote anyway. One note found near a workers' village reads, "You are the reason my mother scolds me. I burn bread and smile while it blackens. My thoughts are not where they should be." Another, found decades later, buried beneath temple steps, simply says, "Did you notice I wore your favorite color today?" This was their version of thinking of you. Unlike modern texts, which can be deleted, rephrased, or ghosted away, these notes were carved, permanent. They didn't try to be perfect. They didn't perform. They confessed. And in their imperfection, they became something more than messages. They became memory. Love, in ancient Egypt, was not only public in its celebration, it was also deeply private in its expression. These whispered exchanges on pottery captured the essences of real affection, the awkwardness of first attraction, the nervous rereads of a message before hiding it under a date basket. Even the gods were not immune to such longing. Temple art shows deities writing to one another, sending tokens through priests and messengers, exchanging poems in festivals. If the divine could crave connection, why shouldn't humans? And what makes these notes so moving today, thousands of years later, is that they remind us how little the human heart has changed. We still stumble over feelings. We still look for signs. We still write words we hope someone will treasure. But there's something ancient Egypt offers that we've nearly lost. The ritual of writing with our hands, with our full presence. There was no autocorrect, no emoji to soften intent. Every letter, every curve of the ink was chosen. And in that act of physical inscription, a piece of the writer was left behind. Perhaps this is why so many of these notes feel like artifacts of the soul. They weren't designed to go viral. They were crafted to touch, to linger, to live inside someone's pocket or memory. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine it cleaner or kinder than it was. But this much is true. The people of Egypt knew how to hold love gently, how to let it unfold slowly, and how to speak it even when their voices shook. Bennu and his mysterious fig girl, their story may have faded, their names lost, but their notes remain. Quiet testaments to the timeless ache of wanting someone to know, I see you, I think of you, I am brave enough to say it. And maybe that's what we need to remember, not just how to love, but how to speak love, not with speed, or flair, or filters, but with care, with risk, with clay beneath our fingernails, and hearts wide open. Long before digital hearts blinked on screens or whispered notifications, stirred midnight cravings for attention, the people of ancient Egypt had a different kind of message, one made not of pixels, but of clay. And what they etched into those sun-baked shards, simple, raw, and wildly human, may be more honest than anything we send today. They were called astraca, broken pieces of pottery or limestone, often discarded from daily life. But to the Egyptians, they became canvases of connection. Among tax records, grocery tallies, and lesson notes lay confessions of longing, of flirtation, of love. And in the city of Thebes, a young spice seller named Bennu used them the way we use texts now to reach out to someone who made his chest flutter. He first saw her by the pomegranate stall. She was laughing, arguing about prices with the vendor, and tucking her braid beneath a scarf that kept slipping off her shoulder. Bennu didn't know her name, but he knew her laugh, and he knew the strange trembling that entered his fingers whenever she passed. So he did what young lovers do when words won't stay in their mouths. He wrote, I saw you again. He carved carefully into a broken bowl. You dropped a fig and smiled as if it meant the sun would rise. I haven't slept well since. He didn't sign it. He didn't dare hand it to her. Instead, he placed it beneath the base of the fig basket he'd delivered to her stall each morning. She never spoke of it. But the next week, another piece of pottery appeared near his own stand. The sun rises, whether I drop figs or not, it read. But thank you. Your scent is cinnamon. Are you always this bold? And so it began. A secret courtship through broken shards to people, leaving pieces of themselves hidden in plain sight. Theirs was not a love of declarations, but of slow reveals. It lived not in grand gestures, but in fragments of fired clay, passed like sacred relics between strangers, becoming something more. This wasn't rare. All across Egypt, love messages were hidden in plain sight, in temples, along garden walls, even in the folds of papyrus scrolls. Lovers wrote with reed pens dipped in ink made of soot and wine. Their messages were playful, sharp, or aching, but always personal, and above all brave, because there's a peculiar kind of courage in writing your desire without certainty it will be received, or welcomed, or even seen, but they wrote anyway. One note found near a worker's village reads, "You are the reason my mother scolds me. I burn bread and smile while it blackens. My thoughts are not where they should be." Another, found decades later, buried beneath temple steps, simply says, "Did you notice I wore your favorite color today?" This was their version of thinking of you, unlike modern texts, which can be deleted, rephrased, or ghosted away. These notes were carved, permanent. They didn't try to be perfect. They didn't perform. They confessed, and in their imperfection, they became something more than messages. They became memory. Love in ancient Egypt was not only public in its celebration, it was also deeply private in its expression. These whispered exchanges on pottery captured the messiness of real affection, the awkwardness of first attraction, the nervous rereads of a message before hiding it under a date basket. Even the gods were not immune to such longing. Temple art shows deities writing to one another, sending tokens through priests and messengers, exchanging poems in festivals. If the divine could crave connection, why shouldn't humans? And what makes these notes so moving today's thousands of years later, is that they remind us how little the human heart has changed. We still stumble over feelings. We still look for signs. We still write words we hope someone will treasure. But there's something ancient Egypt offers that we've nearly lost. The ritual of writing with our hands, with our full presence. There was no autocorrect, no emoji to soften intent. Every letter, every curve of the ink was chosen. And in that act of physical inscription, a piece of the writer was left behind. Perhaps this is why so many of these notes feel like artifacts of the soul. They weren't designed to go viral. They were crafted to touch, to linger, to live inside someone's pocket or memory. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine it cleaner or kinder than it was. But this much is true. The people of Egypt knew how to hold love gently, how to let it unfold slowly, and how to speak it even when their voices shook. Bennu and his mysterious figure. Their story may have faded, their names lost, but their notes remain. Quiet testaments to the timeless ache of wanting someone to know. I see you. I think of you. I am brave enough to say it. And maybe that's what we need to remember. Not just how to love, but how to speak love. Not with speed, or flair, or filters, but with care, with risk, with clay beneath our fingernails, and hearts wide open. In the sunlit village edges of Aswan, far from the marble columns and golden tombs of the pharaohs, love didn't wear white. It wore dust and linen. It carried baskets of bread, not bouquets. And it asked no permission but that of two hearts, ready to walk the same path quietly, steadily, and without spectacle. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not a pageant. There were no flower girls, no rings glinting under chandeliers. It was something humbler, yet more profound. It was a decision to share life's ordinary weight, to knead dough together, to hang the laundry with equal hands, to wake to the same sun and say, "Yes, I choose you again today." Doran and Nefra understood this. They lived in Aswan, where the markets sang with the rustle of grain sacks and the hiss of clay pots meeting fire. Doran was a miller. Nefra sold herbs and binding spices. Their paths crossed every morning near the mill's outer steps. He'd nod. She'd glance. Some days there'd be a shared word about rain or cost. But mostly, there was just the steady hum of noticing. Until one day, he handed her a freshly baked flatbread wrapped in palm leaf and said, "I made extra." That's how it began. Not with declarations, but with bread. Soon after, Doran began walking Nefra home when the sun dipped behind the date palms. He didn't touch her hand. He carried her baskets. She never asked him to. It just became what they did. Not dramatic, not scripted, just natural. When they decided to marry, there was no engagement, no guest list. They stood before their neighbors in the courtyard between their two homes, beneath an old acacia tree. Friends gathered. A goat bleated in protest. Someone brought figs. Someone else hummed a festival song. Doran broke a flatbread in half and offered it to Nefra. She smiled and accepted. That was the moment, the act, the vow. Marriage in Egypt was built not on legal contracts, though some couples, like those of higher wealth, did eventually sign agreements, but on public acknowledgement and shared life. If a couple moved in together, shared food, supported each other, and were known to the community, they were married. No need for witnesses in robes or written pledges etched in ink. The proof was in the practice. And while love certainly bloomed in many unions, it wasn't always the foundation. Sometimes it came later. Sometimes it didn't come at all. But there was always respect, always structured, and always a place for kindness to grow. What might surprise many is the equality embedded in these ancient marriages. Nefra, like many women in Egypt, kept her name. She could own land, pass on inheritance, file for divorce, and manage her own trade. The idea of becoming someone's possession didn't exist in their legal codes or cultural stories. Partnership was about balance, harmony, not hierarchy. Their marriage wasn't perfect. Doran sometimes forgot the herbs Nefra asked for. Nefra sometimes snapped when tired. But they had a rhythm. She lit the oil lamp each dusk. He filled the water jar before dawn. When one forgot, the other remembered. When one broke, the other mended. Their home was small, 2 rooms and a shaded yard where they kept a few goats, but it held warmth, laughter, arguments that ended in shared figs. They didn't talk about soulmates. They just lived like souls, mated by the mundane magic of shared effort. Tanit, Nefra's mother, once told her, "You don't need a man who speaks poetry. You need one who washes your feet after market day." Nefra laughed, but she listened, and she watched how Doran knelt without pride, how he oiled her heels without asking, how he never made her feel lesser for being tired or angry or simply human. Love in ancient Egypt wasn't transactional. It wasn't performative. It was daily, measured not by ceremony, but by continuity. Divorce, too, carried no stigma. If 2 people grew apart, they parted with dignity. With clear terms, property returned to rightful hands. Children, if any, remained protected. There was no shame in leaving a bond that no longer brought peace. The gods, after all, favored truth over permanence. There was a belief then that the gods walked among mortals not to rule, but to observe. And if a marriage dishonored one partner, it dishonored both. Matt, the principle of balance and justice, applied to love as much as law, and so, Doran and Nefra lived not in fairy tale bliss, but in grounded grace. They planted their affections in silence. They harvested joy in small servings. There were no anniversaries, no diamond rings, but there were feet rubbed after long walks. There were fresh linens laid on hot days. There were glances that said, "I'm still here." And in a world obsessed with beginnings and ends, perhaps what we need to remember most is the middle, the ordinary, the beautiful work of choosing someone again and again, with hands full of bread instead of promises. Because in Egypt, love didn't shout. It whispered through shared chores and quiet laughter and a willingness to let love grow not as fire, but as flame, not as spectacle, but as sustenance. Just like bread. In the village of Fayum, nestled between marshlands and fields that drank from the Nile, there lived a woman named Kaya. She was sharp, soft-spoken, and known in her community for her precise handwriting, a skill that made her invaluable in drafting letters, trade records, and temple notices. But her most cherished document wasn't etched in stone. or read aloud in a temple. It was a marriage contract. Her own Kaya had fallen in love with Teraman, a quiet man who carved combs and small statues from wood. Their courtship was slow, like the slow ripple of irrigation water through papyrus reeds. They spent weeks sharing walks at dusk, exchanging vegetables from their gardens, and talking about small things, the taste of tamarind, the way birds nested differently each year. When they decided to marry, Kaya didn't just prepare her new household. She sat down and wrote. With her reed pen dipped in a blend of soot and acacia gum, she composed what we might today call a prenuptial agreement. But for Kaya, it was more than a contract. It was a map, a safeguard, a declaration of dignity, not distrust. It detailed their assets, her weaving tools, his woodworking blades. It outlined shared responsibilities, like feeding the goats and maintaining their water jars. And in an unusual clause that caused raised eyebrows and quiet laughter in the village, Kaya included the terms for separation. If Teraman raises his hand to me, she wrote, he shall pay 2 sacks of barley and return to his mother's home. In return, Kaya promised fidelity, care, and that she'd never sell his tools without his consent. This wasn't cynical. It was clarity. It was mutual respect, transcribed into terms, not because they didn't trust each other, but because they understood each other and the unpredictable nature of life. In ancient Egypt, these love contracts were not rare, especially among working or merchant families. They were tools of protection and honesty. Women like Kaya had legal agency. They could own property, inherit land, sue for divorce, and walk away from a broken agreement without disgrace. These documents weren't patriarchal control, they were balance. They were met. Harmony made real in ink and intention, and the beauty of these contracts wasn't just in their content, but in their tone. They weren't dry legalese. Many included blessings, wishes, even humor. A contract found in the archives of Alexandria included the line, "May my wife's laughter remain brighter than any festival flame." Another, written by a cautious groom, warned, "If she hides the lentils again, I shall sleep with the goats." Even sacred items made appearances. Romaine lettuce, already known as a symbol of virility and fertility, was often mentioned in ceremonies that accompanied these contracts. At weddings, couples might plant lettuce together or exchange leaves wrapped in linen, an unspoken prayer for enduring desire and fruitful love. Some contracts even listed ceremonial items to be exchanged annually, baskets of dates, jugs of beer, or lotus oil for nightly massages. But perhaps the most powerful element of these contracts was what they symbolized, that love wasn't just about romance. It was about planning, protection, preservation. Egyptians understood that to love someone fully meant preparing for both joy and difficulty, not as fear, but as faith. Kaya and Teraman lived together for decades. They raised bees. They taught neighbors how to repair tools and write names in hieratic script. They argued about firewood. They shared figs in silence when words ran out. And though they never once pulled out their contract, they both said it gave them peace. It was a reminder, Kaya told a friend, that I chose this life with open eyes. And so did he. The idea may feel foreign to modern ears. Today, we often associate contracts with mistrust or control. But in ancient Egypt, it was almost the opposite. It was trust made tangible. It was a reminder that love isn't meant to float untethered. It deserves anchors, framework, intention. These documents gave women power not just to leave if they needed to, but to define what love meant for them. They could demand safety, predictability, even poetry. And in a world where their bodies were sacred, their voices were sacred too. At the heart of it all was a radical idea that love is both emotion and effort, that we need passion, yes, but also plans, that we need freedom but also agreements that honor it, that joy is real but so is responsibility. Kaya's contract was eventually found centuries later, buried in a clay jar near the edge of a collapsed home. The ink had faded, but not the intent. Her words still whispered from the past. If love is shared, let it be held carefully. If it fades, let it end gently. We don't often think of legal documents as emotional, but maybe we should, because when we write down how we want to be treated, when we say it clearly and bravely, we're doing more than protecting ourselves. We're creating space for love to thrive, without confusion, without fear. So the next time we think of romance, let us remember Kaya and Teramon. Let us remember that sacred love can live in laughter, in lettuce, and in law. And that sometimes, the most beautiful part of a relationship isn't the beginning, or even the passion, but the quiet courage it takes to build a life with both joy and boundaries. In a quiet quarter of Alexandria, where the scent of myrrh drifted from open windows and dancers' drums echoed through the alleys, there lived a sculptor named Kalon. His hands were large, steady, worn smooth from years of chiseling acacia and alabaster into divine form. But what made his fingers tremble wasn't his craft. It was Omari. Omari was a temple dancer, graceful, lithe, with a voice that sounded like wind passing through tall papyrus. He moved with a lightness that didn't belong to this world, and when he danced during festivals honoring the goddess Hathori, people whispered that he must have been blessed by the gods themselves. Kalon was among those who watched, but he didn't watch like the others. He watched like someone remembering a dream that never quite fades. Their meeting wasn't dramatic. No thunder, no prophecy. It happened by a water vendor's stand, when Kalon handed Omari a clay cup filled to the brim, and their hands touched for just a moment too long. It was enough. After that, their lives began to circle each other like stars caught in the same pole. Their love unfolded in quiet places, in the cool shadow of temple walls, in shared figs beneath an olive tree, in long walks after the crowds had gone home. In a world that had no need for them to shout who they were, they spoke only to each other, and still they were seen. Because the truth is, ancient Egypt didn't categorize love the way we do now. It didn't need boxes. It didn't require declarations of identity. What mattered was the bond, the harmony, the affection shared between souls. And while not every story of same-sex love survived in texts or stone, the echoes remain in tomb, art, in joint burials, in the respectful silence of a society that, more often than not, simply allowed. There's a famous tomb painting in Saqqara showing two men touching foreheads, an ancient symbol of intimacy and trust. Their names, Nia and Kumhotep, are written side by side, with titles that suggest not just friendship but deep connection. They were buried together, as couples often were, their images repeating the same intimate gestures, usually reserved for husband and wife. Historians have long debated their relationship, but for those who know how love looks when it's real, when it's steady and wordless, the debate seems unnecessary. The affection is there. The tenderness is undeniable. Kalon and Omari never made it into tomb paintings, but their neighbors knew, and they didn't whisper in cruelty. They nodded, they smiled. Love, when lived gently and without harm, was not feared in Egypt. It was not criminalized or cursed. It was understood to be part of the human design, just as much as longing or joy. Even the gods held this truth. Deities like Hera, who could shift between masculine and feminine forms, were worshipped without confusion. Others, like the sun god Ra, gave birth to creation not through a partner, but through self. Divine bodies and desires were fluid, powerful, and free from judgment. For Omari, dancing was more than performance. It was invocation. His movements honored gods who knew both chaos and balance, who loved in ways that transcended our earthly labels. Kalon, in turn, sculpted his devotion. His workshop was filled with carvings of Omari, not idealized, not mythic, but true. A tilt of the head, the line of a wrist, a smile caught just before it fully formed. One day, a wealthy official offered to purchase one of these statues. Kalon refused. "That one's not for sale," he said simply. And he never sold another. Their life wasn't easy. Love never is. There were moments of fear, of distance. There were festivals where Omari was called to dance before royals, and Kalon waited in the shadows. There were rumors once about a scribe who spoke too much, but they passed like dust after wind. Through it all, they held each other not with grasping, but with grace. Because in Egypt, love didn't have to be loud to be real. It didn't have to win approval or declare its right to exist. It just had to exist. And it did in courtyards, in clay, in the spaces where two people chose each other again and again. That's the difference. Modern eyes often look back at history with skepticism. We ask, were they really together? Did people really accept it? But in asking, we reveal our own discomfort, not theirs. In ancient Egypt, what we now call same-sex love didn't need defense. It simply was. Kalon died first, his hands still wrapped in linen, the final sculpture of Omari, unfinished beside his bed. Omari visited the tomb daily, speaking to the stone as if it might speak back. He didn't wail. He didn't tear his robes. He sang, softly, songs of harvest, of return, of love that bends but doesn't break. When Omari died a year later, his body was laid beside Kalon's as he had requested. No special permission needed, just one final whisper from the living to the gods. Let them rest as they lived, side by side. In the end, their story isn't about protest or struggle. It's about presence. It's about the quiet power of being allowed to love without explanation. Of two people who carved out a life not in defiance, but in devotion. And maybe that's the lesson we still need. That love doesn't always have to fight to be sacred. Sometimes, it just needs to be seen and remembered. In the sacred gardens of Heliopolis, where the scent of sycamore and date blossoms drifted through the air, and the sacred ibis stalked calmly among the reeds. A woman named Heliara stood over a clay bowl, grinding dried lotus petals into a fine powder. Her fingers moved slowly, purposefully, as if she were not just making medicine, but composing a prayer. Heliara was known across the region as a fertility healer. She did not wear priestly robes or speak from scrolls. Her wisdom came from the earth, from the whispers of grandmothers, from nights spent listening to the silence between a woman's breaths as she waited for life to take root inside her. Heliara didn't just offer remedies, she offered hope. In ancient Egypt, fertility was not a private matter, it was woven into the very fabric of life. The rhythms of conception and birth, the longing for children, the heartache of delay, all existed in plain sight. There was no shame in wanting. There was no embarrassment in asking for help, because to bring life into the world was not just a personal dream, it was a sacred calling. Women came to Heliara with all kinds of questions. Why had their moon blood returned too soon? Why did their breasts ache with no child to nurse? Could she read the stars? Could she touch their wrists and feel what the gods had not yet revealed? She listened. She offered herbs, acacia gum, honey, fennel. Sometimes she gave them charms shaped like frogs or fish, both ancient symbols of birth and abundance. Other times, she directed them to bathe beneath the full moon, or to sleep facing west, where the spirits of renewal were said to dwell. And always, she reminded them, your body is not broken, it is just waiting. But Egyptian fertility wasn't all soft chants and healing waters. It was also fiercely inventive, pragmatic, scientific, and sometimes, yes, a little wild. One of the most surprising tools of ancient contraception was crocodile dung, mixed with fermented dough and inserted like a modern barrier. It created a dense alkaline environment that could hinder conception. The very idea seems shocking today, yet it reflects how Egyptians used every part of the natural world in their search for balance and control. And it wasn't just about preventing pregnancy. The same women who sought Heliara's help to conceive also returned months later to ask about how not to. Their needs shifted, and the wisdom adapted. There were recipes passed from temple to home, honey and acacia as spermicides, linen soaked in oils, or cotton steeped in vinegar. The knowledge was vast. The intent, universal, to give women a choice. Men, too, sought guidance. Fertility was not seen as a woman's burden alone. If a couple failed to conceive, the community did not rush to blame her. A man might be asked to change his diet, spend time in certain shrines, or abstain during specific lunar phases. Masculine health was tied to harvest cycles and water purity. Eroth, the god of fertility, was called upon not just for strength in the field, but also in the bedroom. In their world, fertility was holistic, emotional, spiritual, physical. It wasn't reduced to hormone levels or test results. It was an ongoing relationship with the divine, a dialogue between the body and the stars. Moon cycles were watched carefully. Women tracked their bleed in tandem with river tides, believing the ebb and flow of their wombs mirrored the Nile's own song. Midwives taught their daughters how to listen to their bodies, how to recognize signs of ripening or rest, and when a pregnancy began, it was celebrated immediately, not with balloons or parties, but with ritual bathing, with offerings of bread and oil to the goddess Hathor, with quiet songs hummed into the belly at night. But what made Egypt unique was not just its practices, it was its perspective. Fertility wasn't framed as a duty or a race. It wasn't drenched in anxiety or social pressure. It was part of life's unfolding, like spring after flood season. And if it didn't come, that didn't mean a woman was less. It didn't mean a man had failed. Childlessness, when it happened, was often met with compassion, not cruelty. Some couples adopted, others turned their nurturing to extended family or the temple community. The soul was not measured by offspring. The body was not judged for its silence. Heliara herself never had children, and yet, dozens called her mother. She walked every morning through the market square with her satchel of herbs and oils, pausing to bless newborns, to offer tea to elders, to whisper affirmations into the palms of anxious brides. She had no biological daughters, but her teachings flowed through the hands of many midwives, singers, even men who had sat by their wives and learned the pulse of care. Fertility, she believed, was not just about making babies. It was about making space for connection, for reverence, for the sacred knowledge that every body, whether it births or doesn't, holds ancient wisdom. When Heliara died, she was buried near the old fig grove, her grave marked not by gold or titles, but by the shape of a blooming pomegranate, the fruit of fertility, yes, but also of life's many seeds. Seeds of care, seeds of choice, seeds of quiet strength. And still, long after her passing, her name was whispered in prayer. Not because she guaranteed children, but because she reminded people that their worth was never measured by what they could produce, but by how they loved, how they listened, how they walked with tenderness through the mysteries of their bodies. In a world that often reduces fertility to success or failure, numbers or shame, maybe we need to remember the wisdom of women like Heliara, that life is not always linear, that sometimes the most powerful creation isn't a child but a deeper relationship with your body, a deeper trust in timing, a deeper reverence for every twist and turn of your own becoming. In the quiet, cool darkness of a tomb just beyond the city walls of Thebes, soft light filtered in through a crack in the stone. Dust floated like slow stars, and beside a beautifully painted sarcophagus, two statues faced one another, one male, one female, frozen in a moment of tender intimacy. This was not grief carved in stone. This was connection. This was love carried beyond the threshold of breath. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end of love, nor the end of desire. It was a continuation, a doorway, a passage not into stillness, but into an eternal version of life, sharper, deeper, more vivid. In their belief, the afterlife was not some cold and sterile place of spirit without skin. It was physical, sensual, richly embodied. And in it, sex was not only possible, it was sacred. They called it the field of reeds, this vision of eternity. A place where the body was restored to perfect youth, free from pain or aging, where couples reunited, where lovers who had been separated by time or misfortune found one another again in a golden world of never-ending mornings. There were no clocks, no shame, no exhaustion, only possibility. Here, the soul called the Ka did not drift like a ghost. It ate, it drank, it touched, it laughed, it loved, and it made love just as it had in life. Only this time, there were no obstacles, no jealousies, no fears. Just the purity of connection, as the gods intended. Maria believed in this fiercely. When her husband, a stonemason named Hapu, fell ill, she spent his final days not in mourning, but in preparation. She brought him fruit soaked in wine, sang to him by the fire, and whispered promises into his ear. Not promises of forever, but of return. "I will meet you," she said, "where the reeds sway and the sky is soft." After his death, she chose his tomb design with care. The artists painted scenes of their life together, him offering her a lotus, her weaving linen beside him, their hands touching in ways small and familiar. But most striking of all was the final panel. The two of them, nude, beneath a fig tree, their bodies curved inward, entwined in a loving embrace. To many modern viewers, the presence of sexual imagery in funerary art may seem unusual, but for Egyptians, it was an affirmation of vitality, a declaration that desire did not die when the heart stopped beating, that love, in its truest form, was immune to the tomb. This belief was rooted in their deepest myths. The story of Kalon and Heliara, gods of life and magic, didn't end with death. When Kalon was murdered and scattered, Heliara gathered his body, piece by piece. And when she found he was missing one final part, she made it from gold and desire, and together they conceived a divine son. Their reunion was physical, their union sacred. Sex wasn't something the dead left behind. It was something that resurrected them. This myth, like so many in ancient Egypt, served as instruction, as comfort, as a map. The tombs of couples like Karif and Lamea were similarly adorned. Though simple in wealth, their resting place bore images of daily life: baking bread, brushing hair, holding one another at twilight. Their afterlife was painted, not in halos and clouds, but in scenes of shared meals and soft glances, even spells from the Book of the Dead included invocations to restore the sexual organs of the deceased, to ensure their potency and pleasure in the afterlife. It was believed that pleasure was part of the soul's health, that joy was a right, even beyond the veil. And for those left behind, the rituals were deeply sensual. Widows and widowers often spoke to their dead, not in wails of loss, but in whispered conversations, offerings of perfumed oil, touches on the carved hands of a statue. In rare moments, dream visits were recounted, nighttime reunions so vivid they left the living breathless. "He came to me in light," one widow wrote on an ostrakhan, "and we lay beside the reeds, and he was warm." To the Egyptians, such dreams were not fantasy. They were communion, proof that love continued. This isn't to say grief didn't exist. It did, but it was softened by belief. Death was not the final act. It was the intermission. What came after was not unknown, but promised. A return to form, a return to feeling, a continuation of the deepest parts of human connection. Perhaps it was this belief that made Egyptian relationships so rooted in the physical and the present. They knew they had forever, but they also had now, and both were precious. Maria, in her final years, walked daily to her husband's tomb. She didn't weep. She spoke to him of her days, of the neighbor's goat, of the bread that burned. She brought fresh water. She lit incense. And on the anniversary of his passing, she lay beside the painted figure of him and whispered, "Soon." When she died, their bodies were placed side by side, hands aligned as they had been in life. A new panel was painted, this time of both of them beneath stars, holding each other not as memory, but as presence. To modern minds, the idea of sex after death might seem strange or uncomfortable, but to the Egyptians, it was a comfort, a certainty, an invitation, because what they knew and what we so often forgets, that love is not bound by skin or breath or time. It is carved deeper, it is carried farther, and when the body rests, the soul continues its reaching. For warmth, for touch, for the one who makes all things feel eat. In the shifting silence between dusk and darkness, when the Nile shimmered gold and the wind carried whispers from temples and tombs alike, the people of ancient Egypt paused, not to escape, but to remember. They remembered the gods, they remembered their ancestors, but most of all, they remembered how to love not just romantically, but wholly, with presence and purpose. And that is perhaps the wisdom we've lost. Today, we scroll for connection. We text to be seen. We schedule intimacy like appointments, negotiate relationships through apps, and often mistake noise for closeness. Love has become urgent, commodified, performative. But the Egyptians knew better. They practiced a slower, richer, more grounded form of love, one rooted in reverence, rhythm, and real presence. And it wasn't mystical or unreachable. It was daily. Karif didn't write poems to Lamia. He prepared her bath before sunrise. She didn't post about him. She rubbed oil into his shoulders with the same quiet gratitude she used when tending her loom. Their love didn't need to be declared. It was lived. Again and again, in the small, sacred repetitions of everyday life. We call that mundane. They called it divine. In the modern world, we ask, is this enough? They asked, is this in balance? And maybe that shift subtle, as it seems as everything to the Egyptians. Love was not a possession or a conquest. It wasn't a chase, nor a prize to be won. It was a collaboration. Two people walking beside each other, mirroring the balance of sun and moon, river and red. They understood that desire was natural, not shameful. That affection wasn't a weakness, but a strength. That sex wasn't an escape, but a celebration of life. They modeled these truths in the stories they told, the gods they honored, and the homes they built. They taught that a healthy body was sacred, that laughter in a relationship could restore cosmic order, and that love even after death was meant to continue. These weren't just beliefs, they were instructions, blueprints, and what's astonishing is how modern those instructions still feel, if we choose to hear them. They remind us that touch doesn't have to be grand to be meaningful, that a bowl of shared figs can say more than 100 curated photos, that setting a table with care, rubbing someone's aching feet, or watching them sleep without agenda, all of it matters. In Egypt, those actions weren't just gestures, they were worshipped out today. We often separate love from spirituality, emotion from practice, but the Egyptians saw no such divide. Making love, sharing meals, bathing together, these were not only acts of pleasure or necessity, they were ways of honoring the divine spark in each other. And because of that, they were never rushed, never transactional, always sacred. And yet, this reverence didn't mean perfection. Doran and Nephra fought. So did Kelam and Omari. So did Kaya and Teraman. But the difference was, those moments weren't feared. Conflict was part of the cycle, like flood and drought. What mattered was how one returned, how one repaired. The Egyptians practiced a love that expected tension, but moved always toward harmony. They had contracts, not as cages, but as clarity. They had rituals, not to restrict, but to remind. And through it all, they built love, not on fantasy, but on rhythm, on presence, on choosing each other in the most ordinary of moments. This, then, is what they knew and we have forgotten. That intimacy thrives not in intensity, but in attention. That love doesn't need to be loud to be lasting. That sacredness isn't about ceremony, it's about care. Omara's dances weren't just entertainment, they were devotion. Heliara's fertility rituals weren't superstition, they were conversations with the body. And Maria, lying beside her husband's tomb, wasn't mourning. She was continuing. The ancient Egyptians didn't fear the body, they honored it. They didn't rush love, they tended it. They didn't divide passion and peace. They saw them as necessary partners, and in a world so full of distraction, so driven by performance, maybe their way is the path back. Back to stillness, back to seeing, back to touching with intention, not habit. Because in the end, the wisdom isn't lost, it's just buried. Not beneath stone or time, but beneath pace and pressure. And it waits quietly, patiently for us to remember, so the next time you brush someone's hair from their face, or cook their favorite dish without being asked, or sit in silence together with nothing to fix, know that you are living ancient wisdom. You are practicing something old, something sacred, something more real than anything you could post. You are loving as they did, fully, reverently, and with your whole being, and that may just be the most revolutionary thing left to do. In the golden light of ancient Egypt, a tapestry of love was quietly woven, not in palaces or battlefields, but in markets, courtyards, and beneath the stars. Through 10 stories, we followed the lives of Karif and Lamea, Doran and Nefra, Kalon and Omari, Kaya and Teramin, and many others whose names, though fictional, echo the spirit of real souls who once walked along the Nile. Each character, each setting, each gesture reminded us of one essential truth, that love, in all its forms, is a living ritual. Karif and Lamea showed us intimacy as presence, not grand, not loud, but constant and comforting. Their love was in the way he folded her robe before sunrise, the way she lit his path without ever asking for thanks. They made a home not of bricks and mortar, but of ritual, respect, and repetition. Rakan and Heliara, the gods of creation, taught us that even divine beings need touch, reunion, and forgiveness. From their story, we learned that desire is not shameful. It is the heartbeat of existence. Lettuce and linen became more than objects in Lamia's hands. They became offerings, daily acts of devotion that spoke volumes without words. She knew how to infuse care into cloth, how to turn routine into reverence. Bennu, the spice seller, and his anonymous love reminded us of the quiet courage it takes to be vulnerable. His pottery notes, simple and raw, are echoes of how we've always longed to be seen, to be chosen, to be met in the open. Doran and Nefra redefined marriage not as a contract bound by public spectacle, but as a commitment woven into daily bread. They weren't perfect, but they were consistent, and in that consistency, love thrived. Kaya and Teraman showed us the power of clarity, of choosing to love with both heart and wisdom. Their love contract wasn't about fear, it was about freedom, a mutual promise to respect and return to each other, even in life's inevitable uncertainties. Kalon and Omari carved a different kind of love into our memory, one that defied labels and endured in silence. In their story, we felt the pulse of same-sex love in a time when it was quietly accepted, if not celebrated. Their legacy lies in their quiet courage, their unapologetic tenderness. Heliara reminded us that not all creation is biological. Her life, rich with healing, guidance, and ritual, was one of sacred service. She never birthed children of her own, yet she mothered a village. Her story is a call to honor all forms of fertility, creativity, compassion, legacy. Maria and Hapu transcended mortality itself. In their belief that love continued after death, they dared to carve connection into the afterlife. Their tomb wasn't a place of sorrow, it was a sanctuary of ongoing love. Their story asked us to reconsider our fears of endings. What if there are none? And finally, through all of them, the Egyptians offered us a whisper, a quiet reminder that love is not a moment. it is a practice. The lesson we take from all of this is profound. Love, at its most powerful, is built in the slow, quiet choices we make every day, not in declarations, not in performance, but in presence, in choosing again, in showing up, not when it's convenient, but when it matters. Ancient Egyptians understood this deeply. They designed their lives around harmony between the self and the other, between the body and the spirit, between life and what comes after. In today's world, where everything is fast, filtered, and fleeting, we can look to their wisdom for grounding. You don't need wealth or grandeur to love like an Egyptian. You need intention. You need patience. You need the courage to treat your partner not as a possession, but as a sacred co-creator of your world. So how do we apply this? Start small. Make a habit of seeing your loved ones, not just glancing, but really seeing them. Notice the gestures they make without being asked. Return them. Make ritual out of routine. Infuse your actions with meaning. Say thank you. Touch with care. Listen with your full body. Love like you'll want to remember it when time has washed everything else away. Most importantly, allow love to be slow, unrushed, sacred, because it's not just a feeling, it's a way of being. Now I'd love to hear from you. Which story resonated most deeply with you? Was it the quiet courage of Kalon and Omari, the sacred resilience of Maria and Hapu, or the daily devotion of Karef and Lamea? Drop your answer in the comments. Share your thoughts, your questions, your own stories of sacred love, whether from this life or memories. You feel alive in your bones, and if you found something here that moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of what love can be, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life, stories that don't just entertain, but restore something ancient and true in all of us. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may you love slowly, live fully, and remember always, the heart never forgets what the soul once touched.